I'm going to stay seating, so I'm out of the way of all this. Thank you for welcoming me, and this is all Joyce's fault. Joyce one day asked me to do a little talk on family history, and I thought, how do I do that? Because it's so huge. And I chose to pick a lady who's the mascot of the Ardhatton Parish Archive, and I love dearly. And so it's using her life and showing a few of the ways we can find out about our local history, which is not just the boring records, but bringing the life of a lady that... Yep. Probably, yeah. That's all right. Is that better? Yeah. Apologies, if I'd known it was such a big crowd, I'd have brought a projector. I'd have found something else. So anyway, I host the Ardhatton Parish Archive, which is just collecting history of the local area, which is, there's lots of books and records at my place at Kintallen Farm, and we have a lot of it online. So this is part of our area. And so this is introducing somebody. You may have seen this photograph. You may have heard of Queen's Bray. You may have heard of Queen's Benderloch. This is Sarah McKillop. Her maiden name was Sarah McEachern. She was born around 1820, and this is telling her story. So she was probably born on Torsa, one of the Slate Islands. Her family were there. The records for that part of Fulling are missing in the early stages, so we've got her siblings, but not the pre-1825 records. But her father was Neil McEachern, her mother was Margaret or Peggy McEachern, and so that's where they were working down there. This is what she'd have seen. So using modern photography, we can see things haven't changed a lot. So when we're looking at our ancestors, looking at modern photography is a great way of actually putting yourselves in their footsteps. Her father would have been working in the slate quarries, renowned as the slate that roofed the world, and it's... Sorry, apologies, I will speak up. Her father was working in the early 1880s and would have been working in the slate quarries, and these were renowned as the quarries, the slate that roofed the world. That slate went all over the world, hand quarried by many people, and if you've ever been down to around the islands, it's well worth it. And the new Atlantic Island Centre has a lot of the history gathered. And so in the middle of the 1840s, a gentleman, lad, called Archibald McKillop from here moved down to the islands, and most likely to work in the slate quarries. And on the 22nd of February 1850, Archibald, who was 50, and Sarah, who was 27, were married at Cullaball. And this, at the bottom, you can see, is one of the old parochial records that we have for marriage records, baptisms. We don't tend to have death records around here pre-1855. And this shows, using one of these maps, the journey they would have taken. So from Ling, they moved up to Ardhatton. And initially, they were in Blackcrofts. It's quite fun going around the old paintings, and this being a popular tourism area of the time, it's amazing. There's some very interesting old paintings of the area. So this was painted in the middle of the 1880s. This is what she'd have come to from the water and the flatter areas of Ling to Cruachan being her dominating view, as it is for most people around here. And our first record of her in this area is the 1851 census. So she's 28. She's moved to Blackcrofts, and in the census she's running a croft on her own with her elderly mother-in-law, who's 82. And she's taken her maiden name again, having become a widow. So it's Mary Sinclair, as opposed to Mary McKillop as she had been. And she's described as a pauper. And Archibald is away working up at the top end of Glen Etive. He'd had lived there for some time, so either he may have been working for Loch Nell, who also had interests up there. Certainly would have been working around here for Loch Nell at the time. The old maps are fascinating. This one just illustrates the development of black crofts in the 1801 census, some of our earliest croft settlements of Ardhatton, and illustrating where they considered were the main roads at the time. And Archibald wasn't always away. There were just 3 children that we know of so far in the following 16 years. So Sandy was the first, born in September 51. No, I don't. Come on. And these are the handwritten parochial records again. And so Alexander, son of Archibald McKillop, and Sarah McKechnie, Black Crofts, born the 20th of September, baptised the 7th of October. In 1855, our records changed, and the new statutory records were brought in, and Donald McKillop is our very first child. The beauty of these records is they have lots more information. They realised they couldn't continue to give us all this information, but we do get more information in these first 1855 statutory records. It runs over 2 pages. Tells you how old the parents are, where their parents came from, what they were doing, how many children they've already had when they got married. This shows Sarah's and Archibald's signatures. Sarah is by her mark. She doesn't write. She's illiterate. She doesn't have a signature. 10 years later, we have Neil McKillop, who is born in Achnacarry Crofts. And it's Archibald McKillop's signature we have there. And that is, as far as we know, their last child. And this time of year, we're looking at 1850s. It's tough. Life is tough in these crofts. It's the middle of the potato famine, repeated years of crop failure, and you're talking about subsistence living with very little along this part of in these crofts. And day-to-day living revolved very much around managing the cattle, the sheep, taking on to the common grazing, milking, processing the milk, cutting peats, growing potatoes, kale, shearing, processing the fibre, everything you needed to be self-sufficient as much as you possibly could. The land was poor, and grain harvests weren't great in this part of, according to agricultural records. They still needed money, and that money would have come from Archibald working away for wherever the factors of the Campbell of Loch Nell needed him. Having left Black Crofts in the latter part of the 1850s, the McKillops were into the new crofts along the shore at Achnacarry. Most of the time they weren't full tenants, as far as we know. There's quite a bit of research to do to collect up each one of the records with the valuation rolls and work out exactly who was living in which one at which time. 10 years ago. The photographs and the postcards and paintings are a lovely way of seeing how life was. Most of these are from Ambala. They are from different parts of the area of Highlands and later. I think things had moved on further here, but they do show you what the place was like. The painting in the top corner is Achnamoyne. So that is actually one of ours. And then we have really different things that happen here. So their life was struggling along, but very self-sufficient. But it's a very tourist-orientated area, and in 1851, the newspapers report of the ex-Queen of France visiting us. And this is the sort of carriage she would have been about in the area, and the newspapers are fascinating. They are very fulsome in their description of people's visits. So the ex-royal family of France at the Falls of Connell. On Tuesday, the 20th, the ex-queen left the Caledonian Hotel in Oban in a light double pony phaeton, accompanied by the Duchess of Nemours and various others of her party. This train of carriages left Oban about 12 o'clock to visit the celebrated Falls of Connell, where they arrived about 1 o'clock. The royal party having selected a day when the falls could be seen to the greatest advantage, the June spring tide having considered the highest tide of the year. The floods of the previous week contributed not a little to swell this volume of water. Loch Awe, overleaping its usual boundaries, poured a large current of water into the sea and about 5 miles above the Falls of Connell. In these favourable circumstances, the cataract was imposingly grand. The falls are caused by a bar or ledge of rock running across the channel at the narrow neck called Connell Ferry. Above this ledge, the current runs at a rate of 20 miles per hour, the pitch over the bar being about 9 feet at its height, a point at which this rock, a point of which it fully reached on Tuesday. The sheet of water throws over this rock about 1/4 mile broad, and the quantity of water and volume is almost incredible. The Queen signified her intention to cross the ferry when Mr. McCallum launched the long galley, manned with 4 oarsmen. Her poop was gaily decorated with carved wood, cushioned with coloured maroon and other enamelled leather. Sorry, this is quite small. The ex-Queen and half the royal party stepped into the rowing barge, Mr. McCallum acting as helmsman. His men stretched to the oar, and following the eddy on the margin of the mainstream, the shallop came close to the foaming cataract. They rowed here for some time in the smooth water caused by the violent repercussion of the main cascade, which raised furiously over the ledge of rock with foaming and stunning noise. It was truly sublime to gaze at the tumultuous rapidity of the headlong plunge of the waters, the raging surge launching into sheeting whirlpools of a circular motion over which the slender shallop had to cross, into which she struck with gallant style. It required all the practical skills of Mr. McCallum and his oarsmen to prevent the galley from revolving in the whirling eddies. At times, the oars on one side of the boat were plied vigorously at the other, and then while the other side was a standstill, and so on alternately. Being now fairly among the raging waters and abreast of the dashing cascade, the Queen could hardly raise her eye off the waterfall, around which played many small rainbows of various tints and beautiful hues, caused by the dazzling brilliancy of the evening sun. Gone from 12 o'clock to evening quite quickly, but the barge became an object of anxiety to the party on the shore. Gliding down the stream at a rate of 15 miles an hour, they gained the opposite shore at a considerable distance from the waterfall, and the boat, discharging her royal freight, returned for the party on the other side. So this is just one of the views of Connell before the bridge. So the party then carried on and spent some time here, went up to Barcaldine, went down to visit Dunstaffnage, and went back to Connell for oatcakes, butter, curds and cream, before going back to Oban and then on to Mull. So these descriptions are wonderful. But you gain so much information. So from that article, we now know what sort of boat was working as the ferry. And this shallop, as they call it, is seen in other places. And it's based on the old Berlins. But that's what would have been back and forth across Connell Ferry for a couple of hundred years. And so, yes, we again move on to 1861. And the census records show that they have moved along, as we found with the birth of Neil. And they're he's still working as a general labourer. Sarah has young Sandy at school. which is just one of the side schools just beside the croft, and young Donald, and as well as working on the croft. And right now we have Sarah's sister Flora has joined her from Ling and is working at a local dairymaid. So probably Achnabar, presumably, or Achnagreen Moor, maybe. Yep. And although they're fairly much in isolation, just getting on with life, Loch Etive was certainly not, and it was a really busy place. And so your constant view would have been of ferries, of sailing vessels in and out with the trade, but also with ferrying tourists around. And these were very much our main arteries of communication. And there was trips, so they were connected up by stagecoaches and boats from one place to the other. And so whilst the roads were really poor, going by sea was your main way of getting from anywhere to anywhere.
That's the ocean.
Yes.
My great-grandfather was
Right. Yes. She was commissioned later. She snuck in there earlier. In 1847, there was a dedicated tourist service on Loch Etive that took visitors from Oban, initially on the Ben Stara, who would take 100 passengers at a time up into the head of Loch Etive, and a stagecoach would meet them there, and that would then take them into Glencoe, out to Ballachulish, and they would quite often meet another boat to sail down Loch Linnhe. Latterly, obviously, that then became Charavang, from one of McBrain's first Charavangs from through Glencoe, that then met the train in years when the train arrived. And so it was quite a busy area in its own way, despite the fact we're being relatively isolated. We weren't apart from all the world affairs, and so we've been talking about war before. This area again would have supplied many young men to go to all the various wars that were happening at the time, and our heritors of Campbell of Loughnell, Campbell of Barcaldine, Campbell of Bredorban were all military families, all required to raise forces as part of their agreements with Argyll and with King, and some young men would have chosen to leave because it was a better life they perceived than the grinding poverty of the time. And so men from here would have seen action in the Crimea, South Africa, Ceylon, Hong Kong, the Boer War. The regiments of foot were known as 91st Regiments of Foot was known as the Thin Red Line in the Battle of Balaclava, and very likely men from this part of the world were there. And just as a point of context, as we've moved into the 1860s, slavery is only just being abolished in America. And it's easy to think of this part of the world being a long way from all of what was going on, except money did come back here from the Caribbean and from sugar plantations, from the money that was paid off to plantation owners, one of which, when Let Alton, Bob Coulton estate was sold off, the Camerons that came from the plantations. And we have to keep it in context. They spent a lot of money in the area. They revitalised a lot of buildings. They revitalised a lot of industry, and repaired and employed a lot of people. But it's just part of that context of where we're looking at life. 1871 was quite busy. One of the parts of where we get a lot of our history and our heritage is where people have visited the area or lived in the area and recorded, which gives us information which we may not have had otherwise. And 71 starts Mr. Angus Smith, who was actually a chemist and did all sorts of other things completely separate, but he was a passionate prehistorian and spent a lot of time in this area. And some of our best records of archaeology is from his work, and just the cairns of Achnacarry and the big moss at Cairn Barn would have been really familiar to Sarah and her family as our prehistory. This is where we get our drawings, and they did some of the digs. Gives us some of our understanding. The family were tenants of the Campbells of Loughnell, and in 1871, again, Reverend Colin McDougall Campbell, the 12th of Loughnell, died. Now, he probably never spent any time up here. Loughnell House had been built and was just nearly completed in 1841, and promptly went on fire, and would lay in ruins. So this gentleman and his family were practicing. He was a practicing minister in England and then in France, and he died in France. But his son did come up, and it seems his son started the rebuilding, and his son spent much more time on the estate and made quite a lot of the changes that then happened. And so our Archibald McKillop will have been one of his tenants and may well have been involved in the building of Loughnell House alongside all the other activities that were going on. Unfortunately, we don't have any Loughnell estate records because they went burnt in the next fire that was there. Other sort of national events, including Princess Louise marrying the Marquis of Lorne, who will become the Duke of Argyll. And there were bonfires reportedly lit on our hills. So there were bonfires at Bonor and Cruachan and at other points along Loch Etive side in celebration. And the census then records the next record of our community here. The family at Achnacarry, on the Shaw Crofts. It's quite likely at this point they're actually in one of the main crofts. This one just gives us a really good indication of we have to be careful when we're researching, that we can't just think we're going to find all the records as we want to. McKillop is a fairly simple name, but both in Ancestry and in Scotland's People for here, we have them both as McKellans. So you have to start getting clever about how you research and putting wild cards and things. So it's not always just laid out simply for you to record. This census record gives us some new information about the buildings. And it says that the house has 2 rooms with windows. So we learn different things from the censuses each year. And moving on to in the next 10 years, Sarah is 56. They are beside Shawcroft, so this is certainly when that little house is now built, whether or not it was built before, but it's likely that was built because Archibald is now 81. He's no longer able to keep a full croft, but they've decided that they're going to build them a OE house for themselves. So it was just a side house, which is, they could have ended up in the workhouse, they could have ended up in the poorhouse. They have got a wee place to live. Sandy's married. Not quite sure his wife's got to in that census. He's working as a shopman, which could have been Benderloch, could have been Bonor. There were more shops then at Bonor than this side, but he's currently out of work, so that doesn't tell us much. Neil is 15 at school, so that's probably Loughnell, but may have been open by then. And Donald's left home. And you get to know more and more about the different people in the area and just how far people moved back and forth. Their neighbours were Donald Munro, who was born in Ardhatton, but his wife was born in Iona, and his children had been born in Glasgow, and so it was his granddaughter, but they've come back. So people are moving. People tend to feel that people are in one place and stay there. It's quite remarkable how many people move around, and there are.
A row of houses right up the Burnside,
Right.
Right up from that house was.
Right. Okay. Yes, we need to. We've got a lot to do with all the actual records to see how many houses we need to find and who's in which one. So yes, it's every time we do some research, you just get more questions. The next huge thing that would have happened in the 1880s is the arrival of the railway. So although it wasn't on our side, it was very much front and centre in their lives, because you can imagine suddenly, although there's been a lot of activity on the other side with the railway coming in, you can imagine suddenly having this railway across the landscape, however many times a day, really just changed a lot of what your life was like. You know, we can hear it now, but the diesel trains were a lot less noisy than these would have been. These would have made a much greater impact. So they would have been pretty much monsters of the time. And again, just showing you different records. The valuation rolls happen halfway in between. And they give you a really interesting indication as to who owns the land, who's a tenant, and who's a subtenant. So it's quite a useful way of finding out where people are and what they are owning and how much they're paying for it. And then we have at 15 minutes past midnight on the 9th of August in 1888, Archibald passes away of decay of nature. So he's worked a hard, long life. And at 89, he just slips away. And his son records the death with Duncan Campbell as the local registrar. Not quite sure which Campbell that one is. We have increasing activity as we go, and different ways of crossing the loch. These are both actually Bonor, but in 1871 map, this is the first detailed map, Ordnance Survey detailed map, and there is a crossing at Connell, which we've just heard the description of, was pretty violent, but there is also a crossing at Ardhatton to Achnacoich. By the next map, 1890s map, that ferry crossing is gone. So it didn't actually, it had gone by the time we got to the 1890s. But even so, it still gets you at Achnacoich Pier, which you still have to get out of there. Although by the 1880s, you then have the ferry, the train you can pick up. Or you walk all the way to Bonor, which is where most of the shops were because of the quarry. And you can then do the shorter ferry trip to Tinault and get out to other places from there. In 1882 is the first reference we have to Sarah being the Queen. And it's a book called Lochreran Notes. There's two books. There's one Benderloch and one called Lochreran Notes. This gentleman was a journalist who's writing articles down to one of the Glasgow newspapers, and then created several books for them. And in January 1882, he writes, "We descend to shake hands with the Queen, the most noted figure, as is also the best known and most buxom presence in Benderloch. She details with quiet good humour how her hens were carried off in the terrible gale, and shows the corner whence they escaped from in her garden, while we look with interest on specimens of fowls with reversed feathers, so rare nowadays in Scotland. I used to keep a lot of poultry. This was fascinating. She has frizzles. She has frizzles. Why a crofting lady in the nether regions of Ardhatton has frizzles? No idea, because they've never been good layers. They all look like they've had a blast in November, that their feathers have never recovered their normal position, yet they really belong to a curious variety of ordinary fowl." So when you find just a snippet like that in a book, it tells us so much. She's already known as the Queen, and she has frizzle hens. And you also hear about all the gales and the wildlife, all sorts of things. They're fabulous books. And again, back to a different artwork. That could be Sarah on the road with her bundle of kindling. But it's lovely to see the impressions that different artists have of our corner of the world. And this, as you say, was Ossian. So in 1885, she was launched in Rutherglen. A handsome saloon passenger steamer built to the order of Mr. James Murray of Tinault, expressly for the tourist service in Loch Etive. And she's quite a fine beast. She's a very fine vessel and plied the trade for quite a long time, up and down Loch Etive. And this is a photograph I have from her great-granddaughter of Sarah with her granddaughter outside her cottage. Why is Sarah also known as Sally the Queen? We have still don't know, the family don't know, but she's certainly found her place in the community, and was she just a lady who sat, as Donnie has described, on a bent tree on the corner, so watching the world, so just knew everybody? Was she a wise lady? That she picked up, herbal knowledge and all the sorts of knowledge that helped people? We don't know. But she certainly was a very renowned lady. The bridge is called Sally's Bridge or Queen's Bridge. The brae between Moss Road and the junction between Moss Road and the corner is Queen's Brae.
The bridge was to be built by the army after the Battle of Waterloo.
Yes.
Now whether that's true or not.
Yes, I'm trying to work that one out because the road wasn't that. Yes, it could be. Yes. Obviously, with her kids are mostly away and Archibald having passed, Sarah's on her own running the croft in 1891. Her son Donald has gone to sea. He's a steamboat boat captain and gone down to Glasgow. Neil's gone down to Glasgow. But then Neil's family starts and we find them back in Achnacarry being registered. So the second and the third and the fourth children are born back in Nardhatton. Neil is now a missionary, so is away a fair amount of the time. But one of his grandchildren, she registers, and again is still illiterate, so we've still got her mark witnessed by others. And we see some changes in the area in the next few years. The 13th Campbell of Loughnell dies in 1897. And we find in the newspapers records of the big houses of the area being let out in total. So that's here, Ardhatton Priory, Denolly and Loughnell, all in one newspaper in 1899, all being put up for rental. And here is the 1897 map, and you can see pointed out Queen's Brae, the Wee Shore Cottage, and the insert just to the left. You can see that it's a wee house with an extra outhouse beside, so it's well marked on the map at the end of the 1890s. And then we come into the 1900s and change. That's another of the Connell Bridge, Connell without the bridge. And then we get the massive construction of the bridge that changes everything, really, which was opened in 1903. Yeah, makes you wonder, did she ever cross it, either by train or by the charabanc that ran across? It was very expensive, so it's quite likely that she didn't. But it would certainly have made a huge impact on everybody in the area as this got finished. The 1901 census, the family are there. Carrie's helping her with the family, with the house. Sarah is a Gaelic and English speaker. Neil is away in Skye at a missionary centre. And we have Queen Victoria, who dies in the Isle of Wight. Haven't yet found the newspaper article to see if there was any local response to the huge change that there was with Queen Victoria's death. And in 1906, Sarah passes, having had a stroke a month before. Her death was certified by Mr. McIntosh, who's the Tanault doctor. So again, boats still very much to the forefront. Our services were from the other part of the other side of the loch. Her burial is obviously likely in Achnabar. We don't have a marked grave, but there is one for an A. McKillop. So it is possible that that's Archibald, and therefore she would have been interred alongside. And in his family then move away. Neil moves up to first to Delavich and then to Lossiemouth. And we have quite a significant, long, interesting history on his obituary. And as I say, I've met his great-granddaughter, her great-granddaughter now, and so we've got a fair amount of her family tree. We're always collecting more. There's still more of the other children's history to learn about. So yeah, that is the story of Sarah McKillop, who was photographed by a local photographer, became a postcard sent around the world. And alongside other postcards that capture our part of the world, they're a great resource for seeing what things were like here in the past. And now we have modern aerial photography illustrating what the area looks like, much of which hasn't changed since Sarah was here. And this is a spinning demonstration, which I don't think we've got enough Wi-Fi, internet for, but I can share it somewhere else. And thank you to all the places I've taken information from, the postcards and the Registrars of Scotland and the Ambala newspaper archives and the maps from National Library of Scotland. There's lots of interesting places to things. And this is all part of our Hatton Parish Archive, and if anybody's interested, at the moment it's just a room and lots of stuff online, and we've not done a lot of things together, but if anybody's ever interested, it would be great to move things on. If anybody's got photographs or memories or postcards that we can scan, because a lot of what I've got is digital, then it would be great. You get to keep the originals. And so yes, thank you very much indeed. I hope a little bit of that was interesting.